In 1904, St. Louis hosted the first Olympic Games held on American soil. And arguably, it never should have happened. The men's marathon course wound through open city streets, roads still bursting with wagons, horses, and automobiles. Spectators walked alongside runners, dogs darted across the paths, and trolleys clattered by as competitors tried to navigate the chaos. It was in the middle of a St. Louis summer with temperatures in the 90s and humidity close to the same. Only 14 of 32 runners survived the course. One nearly died by dust, another nearly died by dog. One runner hitched a ride in a car, pretending to complete the race long before the others. And the winner of the marathon won by taking rat poison mixed with brandy. It was the first event to feature a cheating offense, a doping scandal, and nearly a death. The Olympics were built on how far people can push a body before it breaks. In St. Louis, they broke and folded into the dirt, while the crowd applauded men who couldn't stand, who didn't even know they had crossed the finish line. In the summer of 1904, the St. Louis World's Fair was a tapestry of human invention and spectacle. The city had spent 3 years transforming itself for the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, a 6-month World's Fair meant to celebrate progress, empire, and modernity. They constructed grand temporary palaces like the Palace of Electricity or the Palace of Machinery, crafted from a material called staff, a mixture of plaster, wood shavings, and gypsum. For 6 months, the fairgrounds glowed with electric light. More than 20 million visitors came to see ice cream cones, wireless telegraphs, vacuum cleaners, and more innovations. The grounds also had model villages of other peoples, an attempt to demonstrate the superiority of Western culture and technology. That summer was brutal, even by St. Louis standards. The papers recorded daily highs in the 90s. By late August, the air above the fairgrounds rippled like glass, and dust from unpaved roads stuck to the sweat of every pedestrian. It was against this backdrop of exceptionalism that the 1904 Olympics began. Track meets, boxing exhibitions, and fencing contests wedged into a fair already bursting with vaudeville shows and industrial demonstrations. On August 30th, when the marathon began, it was the worst possible hour, the middle of the afternoon, under a white sun burning through layers of dust. A few thousand spectators gathered in the new Francis Field Stadium, unaware they were about to witness the strangest race in Olympic history. Thomas J. Hicks was a 28-year-old brass worker from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Born in Birmingham, England, he had emigrated to America and become an experienced distance runner. Hicks had completed 4 Boston marathons before St. Louis, steadily improving. He placed 6th at Boston in 1900 and 1901, missed the podium in 1903, and finished 2nd in the 1904 marathon that April. Determined to finally win a major marathon, Hicks devoted over 2 months to intensive training for the Olympics. He trained on the flat roads of New Brunswick, Canada, under the impression that the St. Louis course would be relatively level. This assumption proved disastrously false. The World's Fair organizers laid out a brutally hilly route, and Hicks arrived unprepared for the endless climb in the Missouri heat. Standing only 5 foot 6 inches and 133 pounds in racing shape, Hicks was wiry but tough. He had never recorded a world-class time before, but he had the grit to endure. He had vowed that the 1904 Olympics would be his final race if he could fulfill his dream of winning a marathon. Fred Lorz, a 23-year-old bricklayer from New York, worked construction by day and trained for running at night. Despite his laborer's muscular build, he was an accomplished distance runner, having finished among the top 5 in the Boston Marathon in both 1903 and 1904. His passion for running was genuine, but he was also known for his sense of humor. No one could have guessed how those traits would collide during the marathon. Lorz would receive a lifetime ban after the 1904 marathon, but he would later redeem himself. In April 1905, after his ban was rescinded, Lorz entered the Boston Marathon and won it in 2 hours, 38 minutes, and 25 seconds, proving his talent was real. Tragically, Lorz would die of pneumonia at 1914 at the age of 29. Perhaps the most endearing figure of the 1904 marathon was Félix de la Caridad Carvajal, a Cuban mailman who turned up at the start in an outfit more suited to a vaudeville stage than a foot race. Small in stature, only about 5 feet tall, Carvajal was an unlikely Olympic pioneer, being the first athlete to represent Cuba at the modern Olympic Games. Despite his small build, he had already proven extraordinary endurance in his homeland, where he once ran the entire length of Cuba to showcase his stamina. Carvajal had no formal sponsorship and had to get creative to reach the Olympics. He raised funds by staging running exhibitions across Cuba, but upon arriving in the US, he lost most of his money in a New Orleans dice game. Penniless but undeterred, Carvajal hitchhiked and walked his way to St. Louis. He showed up at the starting line in street clothes, long, heavy trousers, a long-sleeved cotton shirt, a beret, and worn-out street shoes. At the last minute, a fellow competitor found scissors and helped Carvajal cut his pants at the knee to create impromptu shorts. Carvajal spoke only broken English, but he chatted with spectators and other runners in the moments before the race. Few took the 28-year-old seriously as a competitor, but Carvajal would soon become a central character in the marathon's strangest tales. Among the 32 starters were 2 black South African runners, making history as the first black Africans to compete in the Olympics. Taunyane and Jan Mashiani were Swanee tribesmen who wound up in the Olympics through a path as unlikely as Carvajal's. They had come to St. Louis as part of a living exhibit in the World's Fair. Both men had served as dispatch runners during the recently ended Second Boer War, carrying messages on foot for Boer commanders, so they were naturally fit for distance running. In St. Louis, they were employed as performers, appearing in mock battles in traditional attire for the fair's crowds. When Olympic officials saw their running ability, they invited the pair to join the Olympic marathon field as a novelty. Neither had any formal training, and they even ran the marathon barefoot, according to many reports. The U.S. squad included several of the country's best marathoners of the era. Among them, Samuel Mallour, winner of the 1902 Boston Marathon, John Lorden, the reigning 1903 champion, Michael Spring, the 1904 Boston winner, and Arthur Newton, a veteran who had placed 5th in the 1900 Olympic Marathon in Paris. Newton and another American, David Neeland, had even raced and medaled in track events days before the marathon, demonstrating the versatile athleticism of the time. Another entrant, Albert Corey, was a French-born runner living in Chicago. Corey technically competed under the flag of France, though he had immigrated to the US. He worked by day in a Chicago slaughterhouse, but had the lean physique of a distance man and was counted among the favorites. All told, 32 men from 7 nations gathered at the starting line. The stage was set for a race that no one would forget. The course that waited for them was nothing like the marathons now. It was 24 miles and 1,500 yards, shorter than the modern distance, but far more brutal. The route began inside Francis Field, the new stadium built for the World's Fair. The runners circled the track 5 times before spilling out into the streets of St. Louis, heading west through the city and into the rising hills of the county. From there, the road turned cruel. Dust lay inches thick on the ground, broken by loose stones and deep ruts carved by wagon wheels. Each step was dangerous. The heat and humidity soared into the 90s. A muggy afternoon in late August, beginning the race in the middle of the day, ensured the athletes would toil under the most intense sun. 7 major hills cut across the route, some climbing nearly 300 feet before dropping just as sharply. Even worse, the course wasn't closed. Horse-drawn wagons and trolleys crossed the path at random. Delivery carts rattled by. People walked their dogs along the route, unaware they were stepping into the middle of an Olympic event. Automobiles carrying judges and doctors drove just ahead of the runners, their engines coughing smoke into the dry air. Reporters said the streets were inches deep in dust. Each time an automobile passed, it raised a cloud thick enough to blind runners and choke them where they were. Worst of all, there was almost no water. James E. Sullivan, the man overseeing the games, believed dehydration made athletes stronger, an experiment to see how far the body could go without relief. Under his direction, only 2 water sources were placed along the entire course, a roadside well near mile 6, and a single station halfway through the race. For more than 20 miles, the runners would move through dust and heat with nothing to drink. At 3:03 p.m., under a white sun and an air so heavy it shimmered, 32 men began their run into the worst conditions the Olympics had ever seen. The crowd roared as they circled the stadium 5 times, the first mile of the 24 ahead of them. As the runners spilled out of the stadium and onto the open streets, the field began to shift. The veterans like Arthur Newton, Sam Malloy, Thomas Hicks, and Fred Lorz closed in, jostling for position as the sound of cheering faded behind them. Fred Lorz surged ahead, crossing the first mile marker in front. The crowd watched him disappear down the road, 31 men following behind, running straight into the heat, the dust, and a kind of silence that no one yet understood. Once outside the stadium, the race became something else entirely. The runners moved west past the fairgrounds, down Forsyth Boulevard, and into the rising heat of suburban St. Louis. Barely a half mile from the stadium, the first man fell. John Lorden, reigning Boston Marathon champion and one of the day's favorites, was overtaken by nausea. Witnesses said he began vomiting violently. He staggered to the roadside and dropped out before the first mile marker. He would be the first casualty of the race, but not the last. The field stretched thin almost immediately, 30 men unraveling into a slow procession. The road rose and fell in long, punishing hills. By the time the frontrunners reached downtown Clayton, the order had begun to take shape. Fred Lorz, Sam Malloy, Arthur Newton, E.P. Carr, and Al Newton led the pack, followed by William Garcia from San Francisco. Thomas Hicks ran close behind, methodical and deliberate. Automobiles carrying doctors, judges, and coaches drove up and down the course, kicking up plumes that hung in the air like smoke. Every breath drew grit into the lungs. Every exhale came out dry. The runners' throats coated, their tongues cracked. By the 8th mile, the air had grown lethal. William Garcia collapsed on the roadside, blood spilling from his mouth. The dust had torn his stomach lining and shredded the delicate tissue of his throat and lungs. Spectators saw him fall and carried him to safety. He was rushed to a hospital and barely survived. But the race continued, the line of men moving into the heat and dust. The further they ran, the worse it became. The sound of the crowd was gone now, replaced by the faint rumble of cars and the heavy rhythm of exhausted feet. Sam Malloy, one of America's best distance runners, tried to keep pace with Arthur Newton. The two had trained for months, veterans of Boston, but St. Louis was something different. The heat pressed down like a weight. At 12 miles, Malloy doubled over, his legs locking from cramps. He tried to keep running, then slowed to a walk. Moments later, he stopped altogether. Arthur Newton took the lead, pushing forward alone through the haze. Behind him, the order was shifting again. Fred Lorz, who had led early, started to fade. Cramps of his own seized his stomach and legs, and just past mile 9, he stopped running. He waved down one of the officials' cars following the runners. The driver helped him inside, and Lorz slumped into the back seat as it rolled slowly forward down the course. For the next 11 miles, Lorz rode past men still in the race, past those still fighting to stay upright. When the car broke down near the edge of the city, he got out, stretched, and decided to finish the trip on foot. Then there was Félix Carvajal, the small Cuban mailman who had arrived in a beret, long trousers, and street shoes. He trotted along cheerfully, waving to onlookers. When he saw a group of spectators eating peaches, he stopped and asked for one. When they refused, he snatched 2 anyway. A few miles later, hunger struck again. Carvajal found an orchard beside the road and grabbed a few apples from the ground. They were spoiled, and within minutes he was sick. He stepped off the road and napped in the grass. After he woke, he began running again, and despite his detours, he was still in 4th place. Around mile 17, a stray dog bolted onto the course and began chasing Taunyane, one of the South African runners. The dog drove him a mile off route before he escaped. The marathon had become more a test of survival than a competition. The first to return in view of the stadium was Fred Lorz, looking almost untouched by the race, smiling and waving. The crowd rose to its feet. From a distance, it looked like a victory. No one knew he had been in a car. Fred Lorz, the man who had dropped out miles ago, crossed the finish line first. The crowd cheered wildly. Officials crowned him with a laurel wreath. Alice Roosevelt, the president's daughter, prepared to award him the trophy. It took some time, but eventually, someone spoke up. Lorz had been seen riding in an automobile. The cheers turned to confusion. Lorz, smiling faintly, said it had all been a joke. The judges didn't laugh. He was disqualified on the spot and banned from competing. Outside the stadium, a different man was still fighting for the real finish. Thomas Hicks was 20 miles in and on the verge of collapse. He had begged his trainers for water, but they refused. Instead, they gave him a sponge soaked in warm, distilled water, swabbing his mouth but letting him swallow nothing. Minutes later, they took out a small vial, a mixture of egg whites and strychnine, a stimulant used in minute doses for performance. In large doses, it's rat poison. They fed it to him, washed down with a sip of brandy. At first, Hicks was revived. Then the poison began to take hold. His eyes dulled, his skin turned gray, but he kept running, more out of reflex than will, his body a machine still moving while the man inside it disappeared. His trainers followed in a car, shouting encouragement, bathing him in warm water from the radiator, dosing him again with strychnine and brandy when he started to falter. By the last miles, Hicks was hallucinating. He mumbled about food, about distance, about roads that didn't exist. His legs barely moved, his knees stiff, his arms swinging like dead weight. Inside, the crowd was still murmuring from the scandal of Lorz's disqualification. Then a quieter, uncertain cheer started as a pale, hollow-eyed figure appeared on the track. Thomas Hicks. He staggered through the final lap, his body nearly weightless. His trainers walked beside him, holding him upright. As he crossed the finish line, they caught him before he hit the ground. He had won the marathon, but he had no idea. Doctors rushed to him as his skin went white. He had lost 8 pounds during the race. His pulse was barely detectable. It took 4 men and nearly an hour to bring him back. The marathon had its victor. Out of 32 runners, only 14 finished. In the days that followed, the marathon became a national embarrassment. The rest of the 1904 Olympic Games went on, scattered and disorganized, but The marathon was all anyone talked about. The Olympics were meant to show the strength of the American athlete, the precision of American organization. Instead, they revealed the opposite: dust, delirium, and deceit. When the next games came, everything changed. Morning starts, mapped courses, and a ban on vehicles near the runners. What had happened in St. Louis would never happen again. For the men who ran that day, the fallout was personal. Thomas Hicks never raced again. He lived until 1952, still known as the man who had survived the marathon from hell. His victory, half won by endurance, half by poison, became legend. Fred Lorz had been banned by the Amateur Athletic Union following his stunt, which was later reduced to a suspension. He ran and won the Boston Marathon in 1904 fair and square, but his reputation never healed. Félix Carvajal returned to Cuba a hero. Newspapers there told his story like a fable. The mailman who ran in street clothes, who stole peaches, who slept in the middle of an Olympic marathon and still finished fourth. He promised to train for the next games, but he never made it back. In time, the 1904 marathon came to stand for more than its chaos. The finish line waited, and with the passing of every hour, it began to mean something more. It was a line drawn between what a man is and what he can become. And in St. Louis, the world watched as the runners paid the same cost we all pay eventually, each in our own way. That sometimes it takes everything just to reach the finish line, and all we can do is endure.